September the 12th, 2023. I will now call on Will Short, Regional Clerk, to conduct the roll call. Will.
Thank you, Chair Harris. Chair Redmond.
Present.
Councillor Craig. Present. Councillor Deutschmann. Councillor Erb. Present. Councillor Harris.
Present.
Councillor Hunink.
What about me?
Councillor James.
Present.
Councillor Liggett.
Miss Foxton.
Councillor Foxton.
Thank you, I am here.
Councillor James.
Present times
Councillor
2.
Liggett. Councillor McCabe.
Present.
Councillor Nowak. Councillor Solonen.
Present.
Councillor Shantz. Present. Councillor Urbanovic.
Je suis ici.
Merci. And Councillor Wolf.
Present.
Thank you.
I would like
Hey, you forgot me, but I'm here.
Oh, yeah, Councillor Williams.
Now I don't feel so alone, Carrie.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gathered today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today, their achievements and their contributions to our community. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none, there are no presentations, no delegations. I do believe we have a request to move one of the consent agenda items up, 612, the Moody's credit rating update. Do we have any other requests on moving consent agenda items up? Seeing none, so I'll ask for a mover and a seconder to approve the consent reports, which would be just 611. Moved by Councillor Wolf, seconded by Councillor Foxton. Please use your yes or no button to vote, please. And that is carried. So I will encourage those that want to speak to item 612 to chime in here now, but I will perhaps turn it over to Craig. I don't know if you want to give a quick, I know you've got a presentation coming up on 7-1 that will cover a bulk of this as well, but how do you want to go right to question?
Or either go to the question or I can do the presentation.
Okay. Councillor, folks, perhaps we'll start with the presentation on 7-1, go through it, and then we'll go into questions. And because we moved the Moody's in, we can, no, you want to stand alone separate?
I have a specific question on the letter.
Okay, so we'll go to Councillor Deutschmann for the question first.
Apologies. First off, I thought the credit opinion letter was very informative, really outlined a lot of risk factors and a lot of positives as well for our community. And I want to commend it to everyone to take a moment to have a read through it. It really is informative. So I just had a couple of questions arising from it. And I note in the summary that there is a reference to the debt burden level as elevated. I know, Mr. Dyer, you've often, highlighted that as an issue for us. And it comments that it's projected to rise to 75% of operating revenue within the next 3 years, which then would be above the AAA rated Canadian municipal median. Would that put us out of the AAA category if we were above that median number with respect to debt?
So through the chair, I would say that measure on its own, probably if we were above the median, that would probably not be enough to take us out of AAA territory. We've been above the median before and have retained our AAA level, but I think it's more of a combination of all of the different factors that Moody's would take into account in coming up with their rating.
Good. And I note under credit challenges, it talks about liquidity and higher debt burden, higher than peers. But it also talks about operating and structural challenges related to recent provincial changes, which I take to be issues surrounding the changes under I think it's Bill 23 with respect to development charges. And also, too, there was a reference in here to the potential review of the two-tier governance model as a potential risk. What would the risk, it didn't clearly say if it was a negative or a positive in this Moody's report when it talked about that. What do you take from their comments on that issue?
Through the chair, with respect to Bill 23, I think the messaging from the municipal sector has been, relatively consistent in terms of our concerns about our ability to collect a sufficient level of development charge revenue in the future in order to fund the infrastructure that's needed to provide services to support new housing. And so to the extent that development charge collections are reduced, then there's a couple of different outcomes. One is that either infrastructure gets delayed or infrastructure gets financed in a different way, for example, through the issuance of more long-term debt. So I think, and it's probably a better question for the Moody's analysts to answer, but what I think is that they're just identifying that there is a risk that additional long-term debt may be required in the future in order to provide the services to meet the housing targets. And that, from their perspective, presents some additional risk in terms of the overall level of debt and the associated debt servicing costs.
There is reference, though, to the province potentially making us whole, and the province has alluded to some concept of that, whether it's 100% of the housing target or 80% of the housing target, but we don't have clarity on that issue in order to make us whole. So that could be the third option, obviously, to deal with the development charges shortfall. But what about this review of our two-tier? Why was that outlined as and I could refer you to the specific point in the letter, but if you recall, it's near the end, and it talks about this potential review of the governance structure could have an impact. Do you know what they could be referring to with respect to that?
Through the chair, I think they're simply identifying uncertainties. So I would say that from a credit perspective, credit rating perspective, markets don't like uncertainty. Markets like to know what's going to happen, and I think the Moody's analysts are just identifying that there's some uncertainty here about what the outcome might be. It's too early to speculate as to what that outcome might be and what the impact might be from a credit risk perspective. I think they're just putting it out there as something that needs to be resolved.
I have a couple more questions, Chair, but if someone else is on the queue.
It doesn't appear so now, so.
Okay. Mr. Dyer, in this report, there was reference to capital A and then two small a's, and then there was also reference to three small a's later on. And I'll get to it here. And I was just wondering if that meant anything in particular. It's under extraordinary support considerations, which is on page 4 of the report. It says, while the region of Waterloo's BCA of AAA, which is at all small a's, already places the region in the big A, little a rating bracket. So can you outline what that means?
Through the chair, I think that's probably a better question for the Moody's analysts. I can send that question to them and get a response to you.
Okay. And then one last thing. Under challenges, just one sec here. Factors that could lead to a downgrade, and it talks about the rise in the debt burden, which we commented on, combined with a significant decline in the level of reserves relative to debt. What do we define as a significant decline in the level of reserves?
Again, through the chair, probably a question better asked by the Moody's analysts. I think they're. Oh, my apologies. Again, I think a better question for the Moody's analysts. I think they're their reports over the years have been very consistent in terms of the challenges to the rating, right? An elevated level of debt and a lower level of reserves as compared to other AAA issuers. And that gives us a higher debt to reserve ratio. And so I think their point, they can identify, I think, what they mean by significant. And again, I can ask them that question.
And I was just curious because it comes, this line is used in your report later on, talking about reserves when we're talking about the stabilization fund. But so the line is used, but we don't know for sure what that means, is what you're saying.
I'm saying that that the risk analysts should be able to provide some clarity around what they mean by significant.
Okay, and one last question then. In the last budget, we had planned for $3.5 million for gas out of the tax stabilization fund. Would that $3.5 million be considered a significant decline in reserves in relation to this comment in the Moody's letter?
Through the chair, I can't say for certain. If I was speculating, I would say no.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Erb.
Thank you. To Mr. So I'm just so we're on 6.12. Is that right with the numbers on these merged agendas? Yeah. Okay. Okay. To Mr. Dyer, if we didn't have a AAA rating, what would be the difference in interest rates that we might have to pay for debentures? What difference would that make?
So through the chair, the differential, say between a AAA and a AA plus, will vary over time depending on what investors. So this would all be determined by investors, right? So the AAA rating tells the investment community that on balance, there is a very low risk of default by the region, right? Because this is all about the region being able to meet its future financial obligations when it comes to debt. And so the difference in cost or in interest rate will be entirely determined by the market. So it varies over time. If I was, guessing perhaps right now, if we were to do an issue today at a AAA versus a AA plus, might be somewhere in the 5 to 10 basis point range. So not a huge differential, but it adds up to be a significant amount if you're issuing 50 or 60 or 70 or $100 million over a 10 or 20 year period.
And would that be reflected on the region's issuance only, or would it be reflected on, like we also issue debentures for the other municipalities? So good question. So when we issue in the market, we're issuing Region of Waterloo debt, regardless of whether it's for the region's own projects or if it's for local municipal projects. From the investor's perspective, it's a Region of Waterloo bond that they're buying, and the proceeds are used to fund regional projects and the proceeds are used to fund lower tier projects. There's no difference from that perspective. Okay. And one more question, if I may. And I can't get back to the screen, but I think it was on page 10 under credit rating risk factors, liquidity metrics. Could you, in plain terms, tell me what that is?
In plain terms, how much cash do you have?
Okay.
Which would then translate into what is our level of reserves and reserve funds, right?
So
Because that's where we hold our cash.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Thank you.
Councillor Hunick.
I'm scared to ask a really unpopular question, Chair Harris. On this council, we have talked a lot about using reserves to abate tax increases, and I'm instead in favor of preserving our credit rating so that we can use it and potentially be in better financial standing moving forward. And so I'm wondering, what would we need to do to increase the reserve rather than to reduce it? Just a small question for a Tuesday morning.
So if I understand the question, how would we go about increasing our reserve balances? To a large extent, it would be about increasing the contributions to those reserves and reserve funds as part of the annual budget process. I think that's the most obvious answer.
Which might mean increasing taxes.
That's correct.
Okay. But that would potentially improve our credit rating overall. Yes?
Well, through the chair, without being too technical, we can't improve on our credit rating. So our credit rating with Moody's is at a AAA. It's the highest rating that's possible at this point. It can help to preserve it. It can help to ensure that every rating comes with an outlook. And you either have a positive outlook, a stable outlook, or a negative outlook. And because we're at the highest level, there is no positive outlook because you can't get an upgrade from a AAA.
Okay.
But what it would do is help to preserve that rating for now and into the future.
Okay, just a follow-up. Sorry, I'm mindful that the Moody's report suggests that our credit rating is in danger because our tax reserves are less than other municipalities. Is that okay? Yeah,
so again, through the chair, so I'm not sure I would use the word in danger. I think Moody's credit rating agencies in any time they do a report on an issuer, because remember the target audience of these rating reports is investors, right? So when an investor is making a decision about where to allocate money for their investments, they'll use these reports to get a view of the issuer's ability to meet their future obligations. And so I've lost my train of thought. Where was I going to go with this? I'll come back to you.
Okay. Chair Redmond.
My apologies.
We'll get back to you, Councillor Huonick, if you don't mind. I know there's a portion of this also well on the deck for next presentation. So, okay.
I remembered. So in all of these reports, the rating company will identify both strengths and weaknesses. Even if you're at a AAA level, they'll say, here's what led them to a AAA rating. Here are some of the risks that the issuer will need to manage in order to prevent a downgrade, or this is what it would take in order to move from a AAA, say, down to a AA.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer.
Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Harris. Craig, I can't tell you how validating it is to hear that you sometimes lose your train of thought. I can't imagine the amount of numbers, let alone information, that's in your brain. Councillor Erb actually sparked a question I have, because I don't know. I understand that we take on debt for area municipalities, and that is deemed as under our AAA rating as a region. But were we to lose that AAA rating and be downgraded to another rate, would that impact then be felt by area municipalities? How do we sort of do that ledger transfer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so through the chair, the short answer is absolutely. Okay. So the Municipal Act prevents a lower tier in an upper tier from issuing its own debt. And so the only way that a local municipality can issue debt to fund its capital infrastructure is either through the region or through Infrastructure Ontario. So the local municipalities have been able to benefit from the region's AAA credit rating. And because they don't issue themselves, they don't have their own credit rating. So if circumstances were such that the region's credit rating was downgraded, then that's a downgrade that's felt by everybody, including the local municipalities who would be issuing new debt under a lower credit rating.
Councillor Foxton.
Thank you, and through the chair. Now, Greg, I'm going to test my skills here. So we have this credit rating and we have this debt level. And both are good. And because they are good, the Moody report goes out to potential investors, and they buy. So let's say we're building phase 2 of the ION, and we're going to incur debt. We will probably initiate bonds, and we will sell those bonds out to the public. And these investors will say, hey, you know what? The region's pretty balanced with their debt load as well as their assets. And so we will buy those bonds. So because of this rating, it allows us to stand in better standing with the investors. Would that be a fair comment? Maybe not. Look at the look. Maybe not.
Through the chair, I think it depends a bit on what you mean by a better standing. Like what it says to I think what it says to the investment community is that relative to other issuers, the region has a very low risk of default. That's what they're looking for. And if I may, through the chair, I don't want. I think it's important to understand that the rating is only one of the factors that determines your cost of borrowing. So, for example, the province of Ontario has a lower credit rating than the region does, but it can issue debt at a lower cost, and it's all because of volume. They're issuing hundreds of millions of dollars of debt on a weekly and monthly basis, and that creates what in the market is referred to as liquidity. These bonds, there's so many of those bonds out there, they're easily bought and sold, and that has value to an investor, right? So the challenge with the region of Waterloo is we're a very small issuer, right? So even though a $75 million issue like the one we're contemplating this fall for us is big, it's a big number, in the grand scheme of the debt capital markets, we are tiny, right? And so there's fewer buyers of regional debt because of that. And so our bonds are not as liquid. They're not as easily bought and sold. Whereas a province of Ontario bond, because there's so many out there and so many buyers of them, they change hands a lot more easily, and that has value to investors. So they can actually issue. So we issue at a premium to the province, even though we have a higher credit rating, if that makes sense.
Good. Councillor Verbenovic.
Thank you very much, and thanks for some of your responses, Mr. Dyer. I guess I just want to maybe ask you to tweak one of your pieces of feedback, and it's the notion that the area municipalities benefit from the region's credit rating, and that's true. Because of the system that's in place. But I think it's also fair to say that the region benefits from the good fiscal management of the area municipalities, which helps shape its credit rating because you get the debt for all of us, and our area municipalities are generally well managed. So I think we collectively benefit from each other, and I just think that that's an important clarification to be made.
Okay, I do see Councillor Deutschman. Do you have any further questions, or you do? Yep, go ahead.
So I just wanted to touch base because we're talking about reducing reserves and the impact on the credit rating. And I've never heard anyone talk about any other reserves other than the tax stabilization fund or the working fund. And Craig, we always use the tax stabilization fund to reduce the tax rate burden or the tax burden on the taxpayers of the region. For example, we committed $3.5 million from the tax stabilization fund for gas. We anticipated what the price would be, thought we might have to use it, and there's a good chance we won't have to use it. But the point is, we already made that commitment of $3.5 million. And if we had to use it, and let's say there was no surplus at the end of the year to replenish the tax stabilization fund, you're not suggesting that would jeopardize our AAA credit rating because we had to use $3.5 million from the tax stabilization fund to cover that. Is that the suggestion here today? Just for clarification, because everyone's saying if we reduce the reserves, it's going to impact our AAA credit rating, but I wanted to give an example of one situation.
Sorry, through the chair, I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm not sure if it's a question for me, actually.
Well, it is a question for you, yes.
Could I ask you to
Okay, so
rephrase it?
we'll take it. We used $3.5 million. That came from the tax stabilization fund, or proposed to come from the tax stabilization fund, correct?
That's correct.
And that is, we wouldn't go to the taxpayer for that $3.5 million directly. We would take it out of the tax stabilization fund, right?
Right.
So that would be to reduce the tax burden of our taxpayers.
Correct.
Okay, and if there was no surplus, we wouldn't be putting back the $3.5 million at the end of the year. It would be $3.5 million less in the tax stabilization fund.
All other things being equal, yes.
So that's a reduction in our reserves.
Right.
Is that going to impact our AAA credit rating in the relation to the Moody's letter here, that that's the sort of substantial decline?
Well, through the chair, I'm not sure it's a fair representation, but it's certainly not something that I'm suggesting.
I'm just clarifying, because people talk about reduction in reserves and impacting potentially our AAA credit rating.
Right.
So I'm just trying to put it in perspective here. Are we talking about those sorts of impacts on the tax stabilization fund, or something else that no one I know of around this horseshoe has ever suggested that could have that sort of impact on our AAA credit rating?
Well, through the chair, the language that Moody's uses in their report is a significant decline in reserves and reserve fund balances. I can get clarity around what they mean. I don't think they mean a $3.5 million reduction on, $400 or $450 million of reserves. That's probably not significant. So that event in and of itself is likely insufficient to produce a credit rating downgrade.
Okay, that's exactly what I was looking for. $450 million is the approximate estimate of our reserves overall?
Approximately.
Okay, thank you.
So like 1%, whatever. Okay, I will entertain a motion to move the Moody's credit rating update report 612. Just for information. Okay, sorry, we don't need to do that then. I'll move on to item 7.1, thriving economy and 5-year continuity tax stabilization reserve and working fund reserve. I'll call on Craig Dyer to speak to this report and to provide a presentation.
So thank you to the chair. We've got a very short slide deck here that actually briefly covers each of the 3 finance reports that are on the agenda today. So I'll move through them very quickly, given that 2 of them have already been dealt with. If we move to the next slide. So the first one was just an update on our fall 2023 debenture issuance plans, and we wanted to provide this to committee in advance of presenting you with a series of bylaws to be approved. So the report just runs through some of the provisions of the Municipal Act. We talk about the debt repayment limit. We've already talked about the region's capital financing principles. So if we go to the next slide. So this table shows us where we're at right now, and this table is an update of the one that was on the original agenda from last week. We're still adjusting some of these numbers, so we are planning a $73.8 million issue sometime this fall with the region and 5 of the 7 area municipalities participating. Some of the debt issued over 10 years, some over 20 years, but again, in total, about $73.8 million. Rates continue to fluctuate, continue to drift a little bit higher. We're currently at a point where the rates we'd be issuing if we were to issue today would be the highest rates that we've experienced over the last 15 years. That being said, still relatively attractive rates, again, partly due to the favorable credit rating that the region has. We'd be somewhere in the 4.8% range for a 10-year term, and somewhere probably now just north of 5% for a 20-year term. So we'll continue to work with the area municipal partners to finalize these numbers, and we've started discussions with our fiscal agent syndicate to actually get an issue placed in the market later this fall. On the next slide, you'll see how some of these reports are related. So credit rating update, I think we've covered most of this. Highest possible rating. The rating talks about the different factors, both positive and negative. If we go to the next slide, please. So here's the credit strengths and risks. And I referred in the previous committee meeting, we were talking about the level of debt growth, and the Moody's rating acknowledges this. The slower pace of debt growth has emphasized is because the region is emphasizing other capital financing sources, including pay-as-you-go financing. And that's just indicative of the fact that our overall level of debt has remained relatively flat over the last number of years. And we've talked about some of the credit risks. So I'll move on to the final report and the next slide, which is the 5-year continuity of tax stabilization and working funds reserves. This was a request that was made, I believe, at an earlier meeting this year, focusing on tax stabilization and working funds. And again, just as a reminder, tax stabilization reserve, the purpose of that reserve is to provide a source of funds to temporarily mitigate or phase in a significant property tax impact, or provide funding for one-time initiatives. Working funds reserves is all about making sure we have a base amount of cash flow and to mitigate any risks of a cash flow shortfall. As we talked about in an earlier report, this is predominantly an issue in the first 3 months of the year, and having adequate reserve balances, again, mitigates the risk to credit rating downgrade. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is the summary of the continuity of the tax stabilization reserve, and I've just highlighted a couple of rows here. And the point is really to show that over time we have been relying a little bit more each year on the funding that's in the tax stabilization reserve. I think the way Council has used it and how it's proposed to use it in the 2023 budget is appropriate. We haven't strayed from the philosophy, if you will, the purpose of the tax stabilization reserve. It's doing what it needed to do. And each year we've been able to bump the reserve balance back up to its $15 million target so that we're starting each budget year with that $15 million. That gives Council some flexibility to use that reserve if and when needed. Next slide, please. And so in terms of key messages, trying to take these 3 reports together, including the asset renewal report that was on the Planning and Works agenda. For us, this is all about long-term financial sustainability. It's about making sure we're issuing the right kind of debt for the right projects and using pay-as-you-go funding for our asset renewal projects. We need stable and sufficient reserves to deal with planned and unplanned expenditure. We want to have some stabilization funding available to deal with issues that might come up over the course of the year. And again, we've talked about mitigating the risk of a credit downgrade. Next slide. So the other discussion that we've had, I think at various times, including during the last budget, is how to best use the tax stabilization reserve. And I think the way the specific uses of the reserve, generally speaking, have been quite appropriate. I think I would encourage Council to be mindful that using the reserve simply to reduce a tax increase may not be sustainable, especially in a circumstance where we think we'll be running very close to budget at year end. So if a material amount of money was taken out of a reserve to reduce the levy, Council will be counting on that money being available then for in future years as well. And at some point, unless if we're not able to replenish the reserve, then that reserve revenue is going to have to come out of the budget, and we basically pushed an increase from one year to the next. So I think it's important to keep future years in mind as decisions are being made about how to use reserves. I think that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chair.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Councillor Deutschmann.
Thank you. Mr. Dyer, I appreciate the continuity of tax stabilization reserve, but I thought we were going to get one on the working fund as well.
So through the chair, so we indicated in the report that's before you today that we have not drawn on the working funds reserve over the last 5 years.
So that's $10 million.
So that $10 million has been in place for the last 5 years, yes.
And we've not used any of it the whole time.
That's correct.
Okay, good to know. I note in the Appendix B that well, first of all, do you recall why the tax stabilization reserve was bumped from 10 million to 15 million?
Yeah, so through the chair, it was increased to reflect, I think, what at the time the Administration and Finance Committee felt was a more appropriate balance given the overall quantum of the region's levy. So making sure that with the amount of the region's budget, the variety of services, the varieties of risks that we're trying to manage, it was felt to be appropriate at the time to increase the balance from 10 million to 15 million.
And I just want, Mr. Chair, I have some other questions, but if there's other people on the list.
There is not at this time, so,
thank you.
but when there is, I will go to them, once you.
All right, just give me the high sign, thanks. Mr. I note that in 2022, again on Appendix B, maybe Appendix B could be thrown up on the screen, please. And it would be the second page of Appendix B. Yeah, so second page at the bottom. Yeah, thank you. So I note in 2022, it says the approved budgeted reserve usage, the last line for 2022 was 5,911,000. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. But were we able to make the fund whole going into 2023? So it was 15 million at the start of 2023?
Through the chair, yes, absolutely. So the budgeted amount as part of the 2022 budget was 5.9 million. We ended up using 3.1 million, and we replenished that 3.1 million. So the reserve ended 2022 with a $15 million balance, which becomes the starting opening balance in 23.
Okay, and that's what the total outflow shows, the 3.1 million.
Correct.
Okay. And for 2023, you've got approved utilization. So we know for sure that we're not using 8.3 million for 2023 because of the gas levy, the gas portion that was 3.5 million, which in August the report informed us it was not likely going to be used, or maybe a portion of it perhaps.
So through the chair, based on where we are right now, I think it's unlikely that the full 8.4 million will be used in 2023. That being said, since we had that discussion in August, gas prices have done nothing but increase.
Right.
So it's something that we'll be watching, and we'll provide a further update as part of our Q3 report later this fall.
And I just want to use the word tweak as well on a statement. I mean, you comment about the reserve and tax increases, but we always use the tax stabilization reserve to reduce tax increases. By the very use of the fund for gas, if we had to use the full 3.5 million, if we didn't take it from the tax stabilization reserve, we would have been asking the taxpayers of the region to pay that 3.5 million in our last budget if we weren't getting it from anywhere else. If you had estimated tax to be a certain number, you have to find how are we sourcing or where are we funding that from? It's either from the levy or a reserve. So if we don't take it from a reserve, it's going to the levy.
In that case, that's correct, yes.
Okay, and so we are reducing the levy by going to the reserve.
We're reducing the levy by using the reserve fund, in this case, to phase in what a fairly significant increase in gas prices. That's
Yeah,
correct.
I'm just pointing out that that's a practice that we do. We always do it.
Absolutely. And that's, if I may, through the chair, like, that is an appropriate, and that's an appropriate use of the tax stabilization reserve.
Well,
in my view.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I don't see any other questions, so that is, again, for information. I'd like to move on to item 7.2, responsive and engaging public service, the processing center for automated speed enforcement. I believe Matt Chu and Rod will be introducing the report, and we also have Teresa here to answer some questions. So I'll turn over to Matt Chu and Rod.
Thank you, Chair. So today we're bringing an exciting report to discuss the second piece of the expansion of automated speed enforcement in our school zones. So in June, I think Council gave the green light to expand automated speed enforcement to be able to cover most or all school zones by 2029. And now we need to prepare for the expected increase in infractions resulting from this expansion. So the focus of today's report and the recommendation is the processing center and the processing capability for the region. And our recommendation is for the region to establish its own processing center. This center will be crucial in handling the projected increase in infractions over the next 5 years as we work towards our goal of implementing speed enforcement and reducing and changing behaviors and reducing speeds in all school zones by the end of 2028. The current situation with the City of Toronto's Joint Processing Center has a number of challenges, mostly due to rising interest in automated speed enforcement across Ontario. So this Toronto's processing center is experiencing significant capacity issues, making it difficult to process incidents within the required 23-day limitation period. So this means that some infractions are not being processed, and so we're not actually enforcing the speed limitations that we're setting up that we're setting ourselves to achieve. So in 2023, in negotiations with the City of Toronto, their processing center can only process 30,000 charges for us. And we know that as we increase the number of sites, and we've talked about this in previous reports, this will increase to an estimate of about 70,000 in 2024. And these are only a fraction of what we anticipate as we continue to roll out the expansion to all or most of the school zones in the region. So this gap will grow substantially every year as the ASC program expands. So this is why the team conducted a business case analysis looking at comparing the costs, the risks, the pros and cons of either continuing to work through the Joint Processing Center with Toronto versus establishing a region of Waterloo Processing Center. And our recommendation overall is that there's really a strong rationale for the region to set up its own processing center. It gives us more control over processing. It ensures that we can accommodate that the full expansion of the program and enhance speed compliance, or really to change the behaviors by having a network of speed cameras. Also, by issuing charges for all these speeding incidents, we can effectively deter speeding behavior and contribute to that cultural change. From a cost perspective, the analysis shows that there's very little difference between setting up all costs being considered, human resources and facilities. There's very little difference between what we would do ourselves versus what the Joint Processing Center is doing for us with the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto basically charges us for there's no kind of they're not making any profits on our backs. They're just charging us for their actual costs. So there's very little change from switching from one to the other from a cost perspective. So I'll ask Rod to further introduce the report. I know we wanted to bring it to the previous committee here. There was a slight last-minute change, so I'll let Rod maybe speak to that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mathieu, and also thank you to Teresa Mendler, who was instrumental in pulling this work together. As Council is aware, the report was originally scheduled for the August cycle of committee. However, we faced a late quote change from our camera vendor, which necessitated a thorough review by staff and resulted in an update to our financial analysis. Our camera vendor, Redflex, as part of the joint request for proposals with the City of Toronto, supports the ASE process from the physical camera to securing the images to a secure software, through secure software where they are reviewed by municipal provincial offences officers, essentially our processing center. The officer reviews the photo evidence, and if the offense is confirmed and all regulatory requirements are met, a charge is laid. The registered vehicle license holder receives a ticket by mail, which includes a digitized copy of the image and an enlargement of the license plate image. This process takes place using the vendor's system and equipment. The initial quote aligned with the original contract language in the amount of $347,000. This contract language allowed the vendor to establish one additional stand-up processing center. It's important to note, however, that this clause included the original pricing of the quote. In the spring of 2023, the City of Ottawa received council approval to establish their own stand-up processing center. They are leveraging the original contract clause that included the pricing in our quote. However, the vendor is not obligated to honor this same pricing for our additional stand-up processing center. Subsequently, when the vendor ventured into the market to procure the necessary equipment for our processing center, they encountered increased costs from a third-party vendor that they rely on. These unforeseen market changes resulted in an update to the original of an additional $476,964 to the one-time capital costs associated with our processing center. As a result of this updated quote, the financial summary of the August report has been revised to reflect these one-time capital costs for the processing center, now in the amount of $1,190,000. This figure encompasses the budget for the renovation at 99 Regina Street in Waterloo, as well as the one-time vendor startup fee. These costs will all be recovered by future program revenues. So, in summary, what's our plan? A processing center would be established as a new program area within Planning, Development, and Legislative Services under the Director of Council and Administrative Services. While we initially recommend starting up as a processing center solely for infractions within Waterloo Region on regional and local area municipal roads, we can explore the possibility of becoming a joint processing center, processing on behalf of other municipalities once we are operating efficiently. If approved, the new program costs, including one-time capital for startup, will be included in the 2024 plan and budget process. Our aim is to launch the program by the summer of 2024. In closing, I'd like to thank everyone for your attention, your commitment to making our roads safer for everyone in our communities. We believe that establishing our own processing center is a vital step in ensuring the success of the automated speed enforcement program and making our region a safer place to live and drive. So with that, I'll hand it back over to the chair.
Yep, thank you for those presentations. Councillor Hunick.
Thank you, Chair Harris. Thank you for the detailed business case. I thought it was an excellent use of space that we already have. I'm just wondering, do we have any projections of when the processing center and the fines associated would produce a cultural change or a change in behavior? And the underlying question of that is, when does our processing center become obsolete?
Through the chair. So that's a great question. It's difficult to predict. Again, in Ontario, we're one of their precursors. Toronto is there, Ottawa is there. They're moving along to see, how they can actually change behaviors with this. What we know from other jurisdictions is that as I would say the density of the network of speed cameras is really the critical factor in changing behaviors. So if you only have a handful of cameras here and there, then people they end up, drivers, and they know where they're located. They adjust their behavior just locally, but they're not really careful about it. But as soon as you get that full network, then this is when it's more effort for a driver to remember where the cameras are than to actually drive slower, and this is when the fulsome behavior change happens. So we don't expect the ramp up is very quick. So moving from 16 sites today to maybe 170 in 4 years, that's very fast. So we're not expecting behavior changes to kick in as quickly as that. I think that's more of a, we'll see, and we'll keep council informed on this as the program ramps up. But I think it's more of it's a 5 to 10 year effort to actually see the behavior change in the community. So we're hoping, we're optimistic about road safety. I think there's a combination of enforcement and then further traffic calming initiatives in sensitive areas. And it's that combination of these two things that will help to make the community safer and lower speeds everywhere. So that's kind of a 10-year, I would say it's a 10-year endeavor.
That's very helpful. I have a follow-up question. The report noted in a couple of spots that there's a high turnover of personnel working in the processing center, but it didn't really go into why. Do we know of the reasons why that's expected to be a high turnover, and how, what are we doing to abate that issue?
Teresa, good morning.
Thanks for the question, Councillor, through the chair. We have been working with the City of Toronto to better understand what those staffing concerns are. The role itself is quite entry for a bylaw officer or a person that's looking to do provincial offenses. So it's an entry-level position for many folks. So what happens in a large municipality like Toronto is that a person would be employed and then they would seek further opportunities. Working with our human resources department here at the region, we are thinking outside the box at a number of ideas on how we can attract and also retain these employees in the long term. So while we have to follow the provincial regulation on what that job is, so what the officer has to do is very prescriptive in the regulation, and so we do have to follow what Toronto's done. We can also learn from them and with them some ideas on how to keep these new staff.
Councillor James.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Harris. I have a couple of questions, one for clarification. So thanks to staff for your work with this program and this report. One of the things, there's a lot of kind of just rumors about, the collecting of fines and all of that. Just want some clarification on fines are collected, but where do the fines go? Essentially, eventually we'd pay for the operation of this, but additional fines that are collected, how is that, if possible, if it's reinvested in the community, what does that go to? If you could clarify that.
Can I start? Through the chair. Thanks, Councillor James. For the first thing is for clarification on a ticket itself. So the region collects that money directly. Currently, through our Provincial Offences Act court administration, we will be moving to administrative penalties in the spring of 2024. The amount on a ticket is the amount that you owe for your speed, but then there's also something called a victim surcharge. So that's a percentage depending on the amount of the ticket. So that amount is actually, while we collect it, we pay that back to the Ministry of Attorney General, and that is standard in court and law enforcement, that we're paying into that victim surcharge, victim fund that's used by the province for a number of initiatives. The third component is an administrative component. So that's the first answer to your question. The second part of your question is maybe something that Metro Rod wants to help with in terms of like the grander net revenues.
Through the chair, so in the report that was approved by council in June, there's really two different uses of the net revenue once we've covered the operating costs and the expansion costs of the program. The main one is to put it in a reserve fund that will help us to manage, to continue to run the system even as behaviors change. So again, the objective here is that people drive slower and that we get less and that we receive less revenue in the long term because drivers' behaviors will effectively change. So we're preparing for that by holding that reserve that will enable us, for example, if after you're 6 or 7, when all the cameras are in place and behaviors start to change, we're expecting it to decline, but our operating costs will be at their peak. So we want to be able to afford that and not have to cut back on the program as revenues, as revenues decline. And the other use of this reserve fund is to help with some self-standing kind of capital investments on small, let's say, physical changes to the road network. Council has asked us to look at traffic calming initiatives in townships, and I know my team is working closely with township staff on that to find some ideas on how do we need to actually change the geometry of the roads. A lot of this work on road safety today is undertaken at the same time as we rehabilitate or reconstruct roads. So we package everything in one, but that means that we don't have a lot of opportunities to do small improvements at a specific intersection that the community knows are not comfortable or not providing a good safe experience for pedestrians, for example. So that's the other type of small projects I would say that would be enabled by the use of this capital reserve.
Okay, thank you. So the Victim Justice Fund and then some community initiatives on road safety. Okay, and the other question is just in terms of processing, and this might have been provided before, just for clarification. How long is the processing of a ticket from like person speeds and then ticket shows up at the door? What is the timeline for that?
Through the chair, Councillor James, and committee, there is in the regulation a 23-day limitation. So from the moment that the image is captured on the camera, the municipality has 23 days to issue that charge. In terms of how the ticket flows, that same day, the processing center would receive the data, or the next day would receive the data and have the opportunity for a provincial offences officer to review the image to ensure that an offence has been committed based on the regulation. That may not happen the next day. Again, they have that 23 days, and what is happening currently is that because we only have 30,000 charges from the City of Toronto, that's not always happening, but that is the flow of what could happen. From there, the processing center at the Joint Processing Center at the City of Toronto, if they were to issue a charge on that image that was captured, they would put that in the mail directly to the offender, and they would give us, the municipality, a copy, and then there would be something called a deemed service date. So there's actually like a 7-day built-in, for the mail and for someone to receive it before it's due for payment.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Deutschman.
Thank you, Chair Harris. First of all, I just wanted to say to Ms. Bendler, thank you very much. And I just wanted to point out to her bosses that when I had the opportunity to meet with Ms. Bendler on a Zoom call to talk about this process and talk about this early on some months ago, I left that call with every confidence that the region could do what it needed to do to make this happen. So I really appreciate the fact that she did that. And when I learned she was the Mendlers from the Mannheim Hunting and Fishing Club Mendlers, I knew we were in good hands with respect to the administration of this. To those people that comment about it being a revenue generator, and I saw that comment in the report, a couple of things. First of all, it's creating safer roads, positive thing. It's helping reduce policing costs in our community because there's fewer areas they'll have to patrol. All positive benefits. And the good thing for the taxpayer, this is one of the few things where they have the ability to reduce what they have to pay. It's in their hand or in their foot, we'll say, in order to reduce what they have to pay. So the only thing I just wanted to follow up on, and I checked the community the tracking report, was I'm just going back to the community safety zone review. Is that something that would be put on the tracking so we know that it's coming at some point, or what what's going on with respect to changes to the way community safety zones are determined.
So through the chair, we can definitely put it on the tracker. Today, the staff is working closely with all municipalities, cities, and townships to get consensus on the definitions, to build the criteria. So there's progress there, but we're happy to put it on the tracker to give you some a window into it.
Councillor Wolf.
Through Mr. Chair, I have some concerns, like the $20 million that it costs, and that's $20 million that's generated by people in our region who are being fined. I know when we had speed cameras on the 401, and as the revenues started going down, they lowered the speed limit that people were fined at, and then eventually they were removed because of public outcry. I'm concerned that we spend $20 million and we end up with public outcry here. I know we're looking for safer streets, but we've put in 30-kilometer zones. We've put in, a lot of restrictions, and I think people are going to have some difficulty following these. I know people will say it's a choice, et cetera, but, as a city councillor, I know one of my chief calls were from people who got parking tickets, et cetera. So, and I do know speeding is a concern. So there's that. So, but if we have the cultural change and we bring it down, I don't want us to suddenly, start fining people more for lesser offenses. The other question I have is, could we work with Ottawa? Would that be at a lower price, at that original price? That would be one question, as opposed to doing it ourselves. I know you're saying Toronto doesn't have the capacity. Would Ottawa?
Perhaps Matthew, you wanted, or Teresa?
Thanks, Councillor. Through the chair, just on the second question, the City of Ottawa has a very aggressive automated speed enforcement program that has already rolled out. So they already have a number of cameras. I won't say I get off the top of my head, but they're in the hundreds. They don't have the capacity to process them currently, hence why they're opening their own processing. They're not currently opening up as a joint processing center. My concern would be the same, staff would have the same issues that we would continually have to be working with someone else on an ownership that we could own ourselves, so we could process ourselves without having to, be managed by them, and we'd have more control ourselves. We'd have more operational control. But yes, we are in consultation with Ottawa and other municipalities who are considering this processing. But that would not be an option for us, given our numbers and their numbers. In terms of the first question, Mecha, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yep, through the chair. So that's a very important question. Thanks, Councillor Wolf, for asking it. We know that the credibility of this entire program is critical, and we need to maintain that credibility through time. So that's why we're. The rules for both the zones where speed cameras will be implemented, the criteria for community safety zones, all these are being looked at very carefully, and not just locally, but really province-wide. So we're working with other municipalities, we're working with the police, just making sure that we're having a very similar, consistent framework across the province. The province, when they opened up this opportunity for to decentralize regulation of speeds on municipal roads, they're also very they want to be very careful about how the program is implemented. So I think the key is to make sure that we're all very careful and acting consistently across the province and across municipalities to set the right criteria to make sure that this is well understood, and that's the key for its long-term success. So that's what the teams are doing. I think it's that active consultation with both the police locally on how enforcement is working in our region, and with other jurisdictions that are implementing speed cameras, to make sure that we're not, again, we're the objective is not to pursue drivers who are 1 kilometer over the speed limit. That's not the objective at all. Here we're talking about, school zones where people are driving 60, 70 kilometers an hour, 80 kilometers an hour when it's supposed to be 30 or 40, and creating a real risk for the community, whether kids are at school or whether it's a community hub where families kind of regroup outside of school hours. So that's really the objective, and we're all very focused on that and working with other jurisdictions to make sure that this remains the focus and the objective.
Great.
Okay,
Councillor
thank you.
McCabe.
Oh, thank you.
Councilor McCabe.
Thank you. I just a quick comment to just kind of echo what Councillor Deutschman said, but just wanted to really thank Commissioner Getsky and Teresa Mendler for really acting on this quickly, because it was not many months ago when we raised this and we were talking about 16 speed cameras, only had active cameras in a couple of them. So to have gone from that point and hearing council's desire to really address this really serious concern in our community really quickly, I really appreciate that. And particularly from a City of Waterloo perspective, because we've also in the past few years, right now we're going through speed changes in various streets in our community as well. This really dovetails really nicely with what we're doing in Waterloo. So again, just wanted to say thank you very much for your efforts on this, and I'm really hopeful that this will have a really positive impact, not only just in Waterloo, but across the whole region. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Councillor Foxton.
Thank you, and through the chair, I back this, and I back that Council Wolf, sorry, but I don't want it to go to Ottawa. I think something here in our control. We get to see the reality of the situation, the pros and cons a lot easier, rather than handing our money over to an external body and hoping that it's taken care of. And you're right, we're going to get complaints. I don't want to swear in council, but I'm going to say tough poop. This is children. We're not doing it to tax people because they're actually speeding, although we do want to, but we're doing it to protect the kids. And school buses are still being passed when they have their signals flashing and they're stopped, I know. So if we don't act, I'm sorry, then shame on us. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no further speakers, we do have a motion here, and I would call for a mover and a seconder to approve the recommended motion under item 721, moved by Councillor Huenick. Seconded by Councillor Craig. I would encourage council members to now use the yes or no button on eScribe. Thank you. Three, I did. And that is carried, colleagues. 8, council committee tracking list received for information. Is there any other business? Councillor McCabe.
Thank you. Just a quick question on the council tracking sheet, because it mentioned, and thank you for noting the question that I had earlier about union co-op. I'm just wondering, because it says it's happening in 2023, if you could be more specific in terms of like which month that or how soon that might be coming back.
Mr. Chair, just a point of order. I didn't know something would come up with respect to that, and I just want to declare I have a conflict of interest on that issue.
The last item that we voted
anything on union co-op. Yeah, Councillor McCabe just brought up a question about union co-op, and I'm just pointing out that because I'm a shareholder in union cooperatives, so
okay,
I have a conflict of interest.
There's no vote, I don't think, but it is a question from Councillor McCabe, so I don't know if somebody want to address that. Mr.
Sorry,
Sweeney.
I just was being texted by one of the staff. Could you repeat the question, Councillor McCabe? Could you repeat the question? I was just wondering the time, like it says that you're going to come back in 2023 with an update on the union co-op and the potential working with them. And so I just wondered if we should expect that in October, November, December.
I don't have a definitive date. What I will say is we are looking at opportunities which will hopefully further incentivize and protect current existing stock of rental affordable housing. And I'm speaking with our colleagues in finance through the plan and budget process to come back. So that will come back in a more holistic manner sometime this fall.
As part of the budget?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know.
Thank you for repeating it.
Okay.
Councillor Verbenevik.
Thanks very much. My question's actually for Mr. Regier, just so that we, I guess, get an update publicly, as I've asked it prior to the meeting. We were originally scheduled, I believe, to have a report coming back today on funding for community arts groups and in particular funding around some of the key cultural institutions and so on. Some were planning on delegating, but it hasn't made it into this cycle. I'm wondering if Mr. Regier can give us an update and what communication has happened with the affected groups in that regard.
Bruce or Rod?
Yes, so through you, Chair Harris, we had some internal discussions, and our view was that there would be some significant budgetary implications from the work. So our thoughts were that we would bring it forward in the budget process in the next over the next several months. I don't believe we've had any conversation with, although frankly I haven't had a chat with the Director of Cultural Services about this in the last couple of days. So I'm not sure if she's had any contact with the arts organizations or not. So I can follow up on that and get back to you.
Yeah, I guess if we can have that follow-up, but my one question would be, and remind me, was this impacting any dollars that were available in the 2023 fiscal year, or was this only looking at 2024 and beyond?
This was looking 2024 and beyond to inform the budget process for 2024.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I think the key then would just be to follow up so all the groups are fully aware of where things are at.
Okay, our next meeting for the Finance Committee will be on October the 10th. So I will now start a vote to go into closed session, moved by Councillor Salonen, seconded by Councillor Foxton. Please use your yes or no. Okay, and that is carried. We will now start a vote to adjourn the meeting. Can I have a mover and a seconder to adjourn the Finance Committee? Councillor Huenick, seconded by Councillor Wolf. Please use your yes or no. Okay. She moved it.
So she's in favor then.
Oh no, actually she didn't. She moved to closed session.